Right, folks, we're here today. Welcome to Armin Scharlach, Thierry Fausten, and Michel Wang. I'm Bill Young, and today we're going to be talking about protectionism and the ramifications of that. We've had, it must be nearly 80 years of free and open markets with the WTO and all those sort of things. Now we could be entering a period of protectionism about which very few of us are well informed, although some of us have experience of it. There is some fear that it could lead to not just higher prices, but lower choice. Some indication that it may lead to even to corruption in some sectors. But maybe I'm going too far. Let me kick off. Armin, do you have experience of protectionism or thoughts?
Let me comment first on this time horizon when you said we are now entering a phase of protectionism. I think that is partially true in the sense that there always has been protectionism in the past, since we had countries and countries where in this interaction to seek an individual advantage over others, there always have been times and phases of protection, sometimes more, sometimes less. The reason why I very much enjoy exchanging thoughts with you today is that I think we all know that with the recent election in the US, there is a very severe risk that we will get into a phase of significantly increased and maybe not always in the most rational and wisest, smartest way implemented phase of protectionism. And that could indeed change things quite a lot, and probably not to the better.
Yeah, that's true, Armin. But in the past, it tends to have been smaller countries, and often you could see the effect quite quickly, and it could be negative. You're shaking your head, Thierry.
Yeah, completely. So first thing, there are already a number of trade barriers erected by Trump and his predecessors that have never been removed. Biden didn't take away Trump's barriers from the 16 to 20 era. And, all the blocs, to the modest exception of the EU, have trade barriers. China has enormous trade barriers, not only in terms of taxes, but also in terms of ownership of companies, IP control, everything. The same for Russia, as another example, the same for Mercosur. So it's never gone away. The only big bloc that has tried to be open is the EU. And in the EU, you have lost a lot of industries and a lot of manufacturing power trying to shift to services, but services can be copied everywhere when know-how and manufacturing can't be copied that easily.
Thierry, you reminded me on something that I have read recently. As we all know, the car industry is particularly scared at the moment to see how things are going to develop, as it's probably one of the biggest areas where these new tariffs will take place. But there are some very smart, very old barriers that have been never really lowered, as you rightfully said. And I remember that in the US, where pickups are by far the biggest market, the biggest segment in the car industry, they are using a law that I think is more than almost 100 years old, and it was intended to protect agricultural machines from getting imported. And that law is until today and still limiting and preventing Volkswagen to sell their Amarok in the US market. So there, as you rightfully said, has been a very long history of these things in place.
Michelle, your thoughts on protectionism and tariffs?
I do agree with you, because tariff, just for everyone, we're on the same basis, is basically tax imposed on the imported goods, right? So make them a bit more expensive and less attractive to consumers compared to the domestic goods. And I remembered back to the late 80s, when the China just opens up the door to the international market. My mom and dad works in a textile import and export company, and it is owned by the government. And all they're talking about is about the quota, how much you can export or certain amount that you can import, because their bonuses is actually based on it and actually restricted on it. So this kind of tariff, protectionism, what we call it, as Thierry said, has always been there. It's just based on the different, geopolitical environment So sometimes it's loosened and sometimes it's tightened.
Yeah, but even in China, there were two economies. Because I remember my colleague he went out to China to start looking at sourcing potential. And in his first message when he came back, he said there's two different economies out there. There's the closed economy that is basically government-owned businesses, and there's an open economy that is proper commercial business. And the cultures are totally different, and the closed economy, based on government ownership, just does not understand the requirements of customers, and the open economy that exports does. And he said that's the first thing you've got to learn. And unless you go there, you don't know who you're dealing with. And the same I found in India. We found companies that, I think I mentioned this the last time we talked, we found companies that would say, we're the largest in India. And we'd write them off straight away because it meant they hadn't looked outside. The ones that said we're the 8th largest in the world, we knew they knew where they stood and they would understand our requirements and try and meet them. So two different economies, both resulting from this protectionist instinct within the different respective countries.
Surprisingly, I had the opportunity to go back to China early this year and spent like a good 3 months there. So my mom and dad's company, which is state-owned, now has evolved. It's a bit of combination of the two economies that you mentioned. So people still have the quota that they need to fulfill to tick the box for the state. And then the remaining, they have great freedom to trade and to do business as an open market. So it's quite interesting. And I think it works quite well also for personal, like the individuals, they got the bonuses, and the government also has a secure income and controlled to a degree.
I think, Bill, what you have been raising is also touching an interesting aspect that's these tariffs and protectionism does not necessarily always have to be a negative thing, because if they are implemented in order to allow an industry to develop and then are getting lowered so that they're not becoming lazy, like in the examples that you were mentioning, it can actually be the right thing to have some protective measures in place in order to reduce unfair competition in the beginning and establish then a fair competition over time. But the main thing here is that these should be temporarily limited measures, modest measures and time-restricted measures, as in the long run, protectionism will have these very severe bad consequences that you mentioned, and not only because companies are getting lazy because they are protected from the global competition, but also because obviously protectionism is a game, and you know that I know a little bit about game theory, and this game can easily escalate because the traditional response from the other countries and what we are seeing in the news at the moment in all these discussions is a tit-for-tat strategy. So it never stays with just one limited tariff in place, but there is a very, very severe risk of a rapid escalation.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I have to say, I agree for you that the tit-for-tat attitude is a very high, say, risk/probability in the current setting, because the main people on the stage, again, apart from EU, have a personal attitude of I won't back down. However, I disagree with you on the fact that protectionism is good to protect a nascent industry, especially because protectionism is known to stifle innovation, where you need competition to become better. And if you don't have that, you become complacent and you're going to not be pushed until the difference between your own situation and the outside world becomes so big that it needs a change. But then you are already beyond the economic need and you end up with literally change in the civil society that is big enough to happen. Look at the end of Soviet Union. There was economic disarray, but there was mostly desire for change from the population. And that's what, even with big barriers around that block, it just collapsed anyway.
I don't agree with either of you, that Armin or Thierry, that it is good for nascent industries. I think there's no evidence of that. I think it has been claimed in a number of countries, but when you look at the actual instances, you find that it has not helped them, and that the companies that have grown have actually been looking worldwide. They have not relied on their home markets. They may have received subsidies from their governments to help them in export markets, but those that hide behind tariff barriers and supply their home markets and hope that it will take them to the next stage of development and technology fail, because they simply find it easier to exploit the soft markets at home. Armin, you don't...
Yeah, and funny enough, I agree with your disagreement to myself, in the sense that I think we need to distinguish here between the more theoretical example where if, as I mentioned earlier, these tariffs are modest in size and the temporary limited, then they would be good. The problem is that is a quite academic thought example, because I think almost always the short-term benefits are feeling so comfortable that countries tend not to keep these things only for a short time in place, but continue, and then it flips around to the negative, as we said earlier.
And you have to remember as well that when you have tariffs, taxes paid on imports, it's a revenue for the states and the authorities. So, and in most of the countries I know around the world, they all need money and more than they can collect, so they get into debt. There are very, very few countries in the world that have a very small deficit or even a budget that is positive.
Does that make us, should we therefore be very suspicious and very concerned? The US is, whilst it's cutting taxes, it is actually going to become reliant on revenues as a way of filling government coffers. So it could become addicted to high levels of, what is it? They're talking 10 or 20% from all countries, 60% from China. Armin, you want to come in first and then Thierry?
I think your concern is absolutely valid, and it applies to all kinds of political systems and more authoritarian systems. That income that Thierry mentioned obviously has a direct personal benefit to the people in charge. But even in a democracy where it's about being popular to your voters, obviously penalizing other countries far, far away is a much better story to tell in an election than having to raise taxes internally.
Yeah, but I want to say, when you impose a tax on importing things, the people paying the tax are the importers. So even if I tell you, oh, Michel, Armin, and Bill, you're so nice, I lower your income tax by 20%, and then you have 20% inflation, where did you win? Nothing. And that's the trick. Even if you are going to look for locally made products that will not be penalized, the world today is in a state that you need to trade with the outside, not only for your own needs, but also to sell stuff. And as we were discussing before, if you prevent people from selling to you, why would they freely and joyfully let you sell to them?
So I'm Chinese by origin, right? So I still have friends and family members that works in the system, right? For example, in the military of defense. Now, for some, like in the system or for some state-owned companies, it's absolutely forbidden for you to use, for example, iPhone, AirPod, Samsung phone, or even a Tesla, right? And it's made very clear that you will not last long in the company, no more than 3 months, if you are actually using those. So in my view, that is also a kind of like protectionism. However, I just reading the news to you on the 23rd of October, where the CEO of Ford said he's been driving a Xiaomi EV for the past 6 months and doesn't want to give up. So it's not necessary in a way that the protectionism, only from the economic point of view and commercial point of view. Actually, China in this perspective, I just thought it's an interesting example.
The head of Ford is driving, and the Xiaomi, did you say? It's
Yes,
a Chinese car, obviously. And he's driving around in one as an experiment, or? I
think it's just he's impressed with the quality of the car and the technologies, and the electric cars in China. It has, a great penetration rate.
Yeah, it's quite a funny example, because As another example of lame protectionism, when I was in the automotive industry, and I don't know if it's still true today, but when you were going to visit a customer, if you did not have a car of the brand of the customer, you wouldn't even be able to enter the premises, the parking. You would have to park outside the parking area and walk a mile to get there. I don't know if it's still true, but that was ridiculous. And likewise, when we had visits from customers, we would rent cars of their brand, to fill parking spaces, and that they are like, oh yeah, they are our cars.
What do people think should be the reaction of, we're all in Europe at the moment, people who may listen to this at some point, maybe outside Europe, but what should we in Europe be doing when our respective companies, the people we work with, our colleagues in other companies, start thinking about their response to tariffs? And another story I know is of a great boss I had, thought he was getting promoted. He went to Brazil, he lived in Sao Paulo, he was there building a PET plant because of large import barriers in Brazil. And as soon as it was finished, they took the barriers down because they now had their home production. His career actually came to an end for some reason. He had to stay and try and make a profit out of it. But what I've found is that in the businesses I've worked in, where they had to invest in assembly or final product manufacture in local countries, and I went to visit them, I could smell corruption. They were operating not just behind tariff barriers, but to local rules that were ethically quite challenged. And I saw this consistently, and I don't know what it is, but where you have people operating factories and plants on a local basis in a smallish economy, they tend to dominate. I'm thinking in particular of one example in Indonesia. There were several, but only one I can tell you about. We were driving around with the boss of the local operation, and he got one of his employees to drive us for a few days. So I had to take him out of the office or off the road or whatever he was doing. And he'd drive us different places. And we went to see lots of beautiful scenery as well as a few customers. And then at the airport, when we were all flying off to Jakarta, he actually tipped this driver with cash from his back pocket. This was his employee in the company. And there was something very wrong about that. Now, that may seem like something trivial. I'm only telling you because it's the only example I can tell you. But this was a subsidiary of our company that was operating behind the tariff barriers in Indonesia at the time. Is there an association between this sort of investment abroad where it's out of touch and out of control and subject to local rules and fiefdoms and strange practices? Sorry, I'm waffling on a bit there. What do you think, Thierry?
Yeah, Bill, I think it only reflects the local culture. I've lived in several African countries. Yeah, you need to grease the cogs every day, whatever you do. I have an example that was so funny / ridiculous. In Morocco, when you want to rent a flat, you need the document to be stamped and approved and whatever. I still have it in my cabinet. I think on these 2 pages, you have 10 plus stamps and signatures and everything. Each of them costs you a small thing. It's not a lot of money. However, when you process 100 of them every day, you just get some cash in. And that's part of the flow of the country. If you want your yearly stamp for the car, you go and you pay. So you pay the official fee and a small plus. If you get if you get 1 vignette or 5, you only pay the small plus for having troubled the guy during his siesta. So if you can imagine, when we had a fleet of 120 cars, you couldn't get more than 5 of these vignettes every time. So you had a guy going there 25 times, paying 25 times to get the paper. But it means queuing, and all of that. You spend days getting these mandatory documents to get your cars on the road, and it's everywhere. Clearing customs, even pharmaceutical products. You never say it, but you need to make sure they are in the proper line.
And I'm myself extremely lucky and fortunate, having grown up in an environment and in a decade where I had until today not a single instance where, when I was working for clients doing large sourcing projects, where I had any of these issues. Fingers crossed that it stays that way. Who knows what the future brings? But so far, I never had really any of these problems. But I think the fundamental aspect of it, and there I would go back to the idea of game theory. What we are talking about is a very, very classical prisoner's dilemma that you probably all have heard about. And it's very clear that if you are defecting and the other one is cooperating, you have a short-term advantage, which makes it so attractive to cheat and trying to put something in place that gives you an advantage while it is a cost to the other. The problem is that if both are defecting, it can become a lose-lose, or it will become a lose-lose scenario. And the worst situation is actually if things escalate. And this is where we then really end up in trade wars. Now, I mentioned the tit for tat earlier. And here, an interesting thought that was running through my mind while we're having this discussion, maybe in today's highly digital world, where we have much more transparency than we ever had as mankind before, maybe it is a little bit even easier to find the right tat for the tit, where in the past it was highly subjective and very often was the reason why things escalated, because a countermeasure was seen as way more dramatic than the initial measure. And this is why then you ended up in this bad circle. Maybe with all the digital supply chain today, where we can measure things way better than ever before, we will see, if it's handled in a smart way, these rules being more precise than they used to be in the past. I would be interested to find out what you guys are thinking about that.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm truly concerned that we could be about to lose a lot of the very positive things that supply chains have learned over the last years about the need to encourage competition, about the need to continue to invest in R&D and technology in order to meet the next wave of competition. And that if we kowtow to protectionist instincts, we will end up looking only at how we can pay the least amount of tariffs, that investment will be driven not by the right technology or becoming competitive or investing in the future, but by being in the country behind the tariff barriers. I think we could be about to lose an awful lot of what we have learned over decades. Thierry?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. The one thing I want to say is thanks to COVID, and thank you, COVID, for that, people have realized that they need to go back to resilient, adaptive, agile supply chain, and that you need to be able to respond to market quickly. And if you look at, you remember 25 years ago when Inditex, best known as Zara, flooded the market with very cheap products. So they started with manufacturing in Spain, their home country, and Portugal, and a bit in Morocco. But then very quickly they went east to get very cheap things. These things, whenever they were successful, they couldn't sell more of them because they didn't have them. And with the fast fashion, they couldn't have a replenishment. It just couldn't be made. And now they have relocated a lot of their operations nearby to be able to literally deliver next week if you need them. When they see some articles are selling very well, they can reproduce, and with the very good transparency in supply chain, they can deliver exactly to the shop that needs them. And this they couldn't do without the proximity. Otherwise, they would have to potentially fly things, which then kills a lot of the profit margin. So I think that the supply chains in a number of circumstances have already adapted. Where we really have a risk as a world society is some supply chains are heavily dependent on manufacturing transformation capacities, not capabilities, but capacities that are located in few countries. And here we really have a risk. Everybody's talking about lithium for batteries. And say, China has the world supply of lithium. China has accepted to pollute its own country to have the transformation of it. But they have very, very few of the minerals. They have the transformation because the transformation, as I said, is extremely bad for the environment, and they accept it one way or the other. And Michel would say probably they don't have the choice because that's part of the top-down thing, but it's part of this. If you accept, it's like, Switzerland. Yes, we collect PET bottles like no one else. And in most cases, they are exported away because there is no recycling, because no one wants a recycling factory nearby.
Michel, is Thierry right about the Chinese lithium? I'm sure he is.
Sorry, it may not be directly the point, but I want to just tag on the point we're talking about the bribery side. So just some interesting figures. Back to 2017, Rolls-Royce has to pay 671 million as a bribery settlement to the UK authorities, and that has been the highest number for quite a long time until Airbus outraged it in 2020. Airbus paid nearly 1 billion euro to the UK authorities and worldwide around 3.9 billion US dollars on that topic aside. So Bill, up to your back to your point on the EU regulation, and this is what I think. So we have more and more like GDPR regulation, more and more on the ESG laws. So is all these different trade restrictions and not only tariff, but all the import-export control restrictions really put a test of our trading system, which were evolved hundreds of years ago merely for economic and commercial reasons. Now the trading system have to cope with all these environmental, social factors, which just interesting era to be in to see how the overall things evolve in the global economy.
Well, that raises a very interesting point because, as you say, Michel, we do have, call them non-tariff barriers, if you like, the raising of standards, the ESG and what have you. But the US government, I don't like mentioning the chap's name even, but the US new president-elect, talking about a bonfire of regulation, which include ESG, most especially on restrictions on oil and gas. So at the same time as raising one set of barriers, he's reducing the others. That feels wrong to me. That feels like we could be heading for a very dirty world. Armin?
Yeah, you're right, because it violates this what I mentioned earlier, that these regulations can be okay if they're handled in a smart way. And I think we all have our doubts that the new government is actually really following that principle. I would like to come back to one point that Thierry raised, which I think is a very important one, and that is that there are certain areas that can be shifted, like where I produce a car, where I produce fashion. But there are other areas where simply because of geology, you have certain exclusivity for raw materials that are only available in certain parts of the world and not in others. And that makes, in my opinion, almost every country to a certain extent vulnerable if you're not having access to these raw materials any longer. And therefore, even the most powerful economical countries in the world, like the US, I think underestimate how vulnerable they will get and are once these cards are played in that game where raw materials are getting put as a measure into a trade war. And there's really not that much that you as an industry can do about it if you're not getting the input materials any longer that you need in order to produce your products.
That leads us to possibly a much darker area, but one which we're probably out of scope, and that is, do trade wars lead to real wars? I worry from some of the things you just alluded to, Armin, that could well be the case.
And you're absolutely right. I think if you look into history, a lot of wars were the consequence of getting access to raw materials that you did not have before in your own area of influence.
We've talked around this for a while. I don't think we've come to too many conclusions, except that we in Europe, it seems to me, need to be very aware that things are changing and that we need to have strategies, company strategies, possibly personal strategies for keeping people straight and knowing how to respond to the situation. Michel?
About the talent, there's also an interesting observation from my personal experience. Without revealing my age, when I graduated from university back to the 19th or early 2000s, it's sort of 2080 rules, right? So 80% of the university graduates wanted to go abroad to study, mainly US, UK. And most people like me stayed. But over the past 10 years, I just witnessed so many people start going back to China because China has so many incentive programs. Not only your personal, could be the whole family, could be the housing subsidy, would be a lot of things, especially for researchers and people working in the high-tech technology. Is government really pour in the fund to build a specific laboratory even for a particular area. So nowadays, if you go back to the university in China, again, 80-20 rules. So 80% graduates actually choose to stay in domestic market. So I just thought that could be another way when you're talking about the individual, a talent or a overall, country strategy, how China has been evolving from a talent retention program.
Well, that's bad news for a lot of people, myself included, who believe strongly that diversity, and I don't mean ethnic diversity, I mean diversity of thinking, diversity of backgrounds, and diversity of education and talent is really, really important. And that if you don't have that, you're in difficulty.
However, there are a lot more foreign students, we call it foreign students, sorry, I'm Chinese, actually go to China, right? So it's not saying that we only keep, Chinese origin students, but you actually see China has become a platform to enable collaboration simply because of the Chinese government policy in education, in funding.
I think we should start to look at final words. Armin, you'd like to come in, and can we make a comment and maybe wind up, and we'll have some final words from everyone?
I think what you mentioned reminded me a little bit on this famous phrase from John Oliver last week tonight. So what can we do about it? And you're absolutely right. That is what I think everyone is having on our minds. And the answer to that I would give is directly derived from game theory, where it's a very rational and logical consequence that in the trade war, all parties lose, and only in cooperation and with trust and commitment in place, everyone wins. And as simple as that sounds, the direct consequence is whenever we have an influence, and as small as it might be here and there, how we can respond to a measure. Tit for tat is an okay strategy if it is done in a wise way, so that the other party is not feeling winning, but we are also should absolutely avoid escalation, and therefore should spend enough expertise and willingness to find the right modest reaction, temporarily limited, in order to send the signal that we want to do, but in order to hopefully get back into a cooperation mode, because that's the only outcome where really all parties win.
Thanks. And Thierry?
I have a concern about the personal stakes that world leaders can put in this situation. However, I'm extremely confident in the savviness of business people to go around and imagine new solutions. I remember a day when I think it was a Japanese company shipping cars and motorcycles as spare parts, and they would be assembled on the ship, not fully finished. They were missing like the mirrors or something. And so they would enter as a bunch of spare parts, which were very low taxed. And within 10 minutes, they became cars that had entered without, paying what they should have paid somehow. And I think you were mentioning loopholes. People are going to go for it because, I'm sorry to say, but business beats it all. I wish we are not going to be into military confrontation, but I will not have much influence on that. I think I can have influence on the business side. But overall, yeah, we will prevail. We always do until we kill ourselves with pollution.
Michelle.
Thank you, Bill. I tend to agree with Armin in this way. So although the protectionism can be manifest in many, many ways, but deep down, once we peel off the layer, you will see that in order to be successful and competitive, it requires a lot of collaboration, across the borders.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. I think that's been quite fascinating. There are no clear pointers that I can see, but it does seem as though we have to dig out some of the principles that we've learned over the last few years and hold them closely over some difficult times in the future in order to navigate our way through this. So thanks, everyone. It hasn't exactly been the most uplifting and optimistic, but I think it's been realistic and extremely useful. Thank you very much indeed. We'll sign off there until the next time. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.